You're listening to Ruminating with RealAg, the podcast that chews on the latest in beef production, with your host, Amber Bell.
This is Ruminating with RealAg, and I'm your host, Amber Bell. For today's episode, I'm really excited to be speaking with Jill Burkhardt. Now, Jill runs Crooked Lake Farm with her husband, Kelly, and their 2 children. She also has a degree in range management from Montana State University and has taken the book knowledge that she learned from school and put that into her grazing operation on the farm. Now, we're going to be talking today about grazing high-legume pastures, bloat, what it's like to run a mixed farm. So listen in, stay tuned. It's going to be a great conversation. Okay, so we're going to be talking about grazing high legume pastures. This is something that is near and dear to my heart, and I know it is to yours too. So before we even get into the topic of grazing high legume pastures, why don't you tell us a little bit about your farm, what you guys do? A little bit of background.
Yeah, for sure. My husband, Kelly, and I farm near Gwin in Wetaskiwin County with our 3 kids, CJ, Bryn, and Blaine. And we run roughly 150 head of mother cows and a backgrounding feedlot. And we also have a crop farm of 1,200 acres as well. And it's all family ran. We're 5th generation here in the Gwin along the Coal Lake. And both Kelly and I have backgrounds in range science. So we do a lot of playing around with our grazing, and we do a lot of rotational grazing. And we have 2 living labs with the Alberta beef producers. This for the next, 2 more years. We're in year 3 of those. And one of those is actually a grazing living lab. Both of them have grazing components as well. And one we're actually not a full component of it, but part of it is grazing some alfalfa as well in that. So we do a lot of alfalfa grazing just because it's what's in our pasture mixes. And so,
Right. So is most of your pasture native or seeded down? What are you looking at
it's all seeded down.
Okay.
We have one pasture actually that is native. Everything else, it has been either older hayfields that have just been left to nature to take their place. And some of them have been seeded back to a lot of them have been seeded back to grass blends throughout the ages. Some were seeded back in the 20s, 30s. Others were seeded more recently in the 90s, but we haven't broke any pasture since the early 2000s and reseeded it. So what we're seeing in a lot of our pastures, though, is a lot of different varieties of alfalfa that we think we're already in the seed bank or that birds are carrying over. And so we're getting alfalfa as an increaser actually in our pastures. Even though the alfalfa has never been seeded there, it's coming back in full force. Really, it's sort of crazy to see, but it's a neat problem, good problem to have.
It is a really good problem to have. Usually it's a matter of trying to keep the alfalfa in your pastures and not lose it, right?
Right.
So when you talk to me a little bit about this living lab and what that looks like when it comes to grazing the alfalfa.
So the one living lab, we're doing 10-acre strips, and the 2 of those 10-acre strips is alfalfa hay mix. It's an alfalfa hay mix, and what we're doing to see is a winter grazing project to see if winter grazing is going to help with our cropland and get yield boosts. The alfalfa in there is to see if after 5 years what the alfalfa field is going to give in terms of nitrogen to the crop. But because we're passing cattle over there anyway, we're grazing it in conjunction with our standing corn in the wintertime. So we're doing winter grazing of alfalfa.
Very cool. And do you have any idea of what the findings might be? Anything preliminary?
Already? Oh, I'll give you a little teaser. So far, we've seen upwards last year from I guess from 2 different fields. Our yield our farm average outside of the living lab field was about 50 acres or 50 bushels an acre on the wheat. We saw upwards 77 bushels an acre on the wheat after year 1 of grazing standing corn. And even the fields, our control fields out there saw a yield bump because the cattle are passing over there. So we're seeing great things already of winter grazing cattle to see how it's going to help crop as far as either being able to decrease your fertilizer or continuing your same amount of fertilizer, but getting the extra benefits.
That's fascinating. We're going to have to talk about that maybe later
Give,
on.
give us a few
But
more years to finish up, and then
to
we'll
finish
we'll
up,
we'll
and then
come
we'll go
back.
right into it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But talking about grazing legumes, so we're going to talk more during the growing season and
Yeah.
what that looks like. So talk to me a little bit about what the mixes are like in your pastures, especially the high legume pastures.
Yeah, the high legume pastures are usually a Timothy brome orchard grass mix with alfalfa, and we have various types of alfalfa even. So we even have some falcata coming in, so the yellow blooms, along with your traditional purple alfalfa plants. And so what we started with when we started grazing this pasture, when we first moved up here, or when I first moved up here in 2004, we didn't have a lot of alfalfa in there at all. There might have been the odd, plant that came up, and the pasture would have been reseeded in 2003, I think, so the year before. And it was seeded to a Brome Orchard Timothy mix. And when you see grass mixes, you never know what sort of extra fun plants you're gonna get. So there might have been a small amount of alfalfa that was coincidentally in the seed. But so we started grazing that, and we did a rotational grazing, running them on there for the first few years about every, leaving them for 7 to 10 days and then rotating them through. So the pasture there's 7 pastures. So you're looking at roughly any like 40 to 50 day rest period on that. So then the following years, we started seeing more and more and more alfalfa. And so we're running upwards. I'm anywhere from 60 to 70% alfalfa on some of these paddocks on what was just some of them were reseeded, some of them were just left. Like they were old crop fields and they were just left, there might have been some grass seed thrown on them at some point, but we've also done increase, with our grazing, the alfalfa is coming back from the seed bank or from birds or however
Animals going
animals,
through and wildlife. And yeah.
wildlife. So yeah, so we've we run the cattle over there. Like as I said, we're grazing them about every 7 to 10 days is our rotation on, but they're larger paddocks and
Mhm.
roughly 50, 60 head per 20 to 30 acre paddock is what we're running. And that works for our lifestyle. So
Yes, for sure. So does that, I mean, with an increase in alfalfa and legumes in general, you're going to worry about bloat. Has that been a concern for you?
initially, yes. Initially, we were like, it was always in the back of our head.
Mhm.
But with our degrees and our background, we had a few, I guess things up our sleeves that we knew what to do and how to. And when we started using we took our book knowledge and then we applied to our practical sense. So, we knew things like, using management practices to try to mitigate that. And
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
let's drill down on some of those management practices because I think this
Yeah.
is going to there are definitely some techniques you can use to graze legumes
Mhm.
and not have the risk of bloat that is often talked about. So
Yeah.
drill down on some of those for me.
Yeah, for sure. And we do different things depending on where we are on our farm. So if we're at the home, like if we're at our home quarter here where the cows winter and, we go into graze, we just turned a group of cattle onto an old hay field that was pretty much all that was coming back was the alfalfa. Not much, there's grass in the draws or, the lower spots. So what we did that 2 weeks ago we made sure we filled their bunks first. We always at home leave straw out for them. Or like if you have old slough hay, but being crop farmers, we have an abundance of barley straw. So we always throw some barley straw in feed bunks out for them, before we even turn them out. And we'll have them, we'll even do that 2 to 3. Actually, we keep straw out for them all winter just to keep them happy and keep them full. But, we'll specifically make sure we put it out about a week before and just start throwing the straw out there and offering that. And it's free choice if they want to take it up. Not a big deal. That's up to them. But it's there, and a lot of the cattle do go and start to eat that. So that's one thing that we always do. We feed rumensin when they're at home in their through their mineral.
Okay.
And we use a TMR, like a Supreme mixer, to feed every day in the winter time. So before we go to turn them out onto these lusher alfalfa pastures, we make sure that we're putting the mineral with the rumensin in their TMR, and that they're getting those micro doses constantly. If you run
So
out,
you feed the rumensin kind of throughout the season.
We
Okay.
do, we do. And that's more so not for the alfalfa. We've had instances of coccidiosis in our calves, and because we're calving right, we calve April, May, June-ish. So, to try to keep everything, and because our calving pastures, I mean, come on, admit it, we're on a farm, on a crop farm, we're very limited. I don't have acres and acres and acres of space to turn them out, and we're running them on stubble right now.
Mhm.
So calving them on some older on an older winter pasture that they continuously calve on. So we do run the rumensin pretty much a couple months before
Right.
calving, and we continue it all through calving. So that's another thing that we use that's here at the farm. And then when we go to turn them out, we make sure that we feed them first. We bring in the TMR, we fill their bunks up, and we make sure everybody comes for food. Once they do that, then once we're done feeding, somebody will go out and just open the gates. And that's all we do. We don't call them. We don't do anything. It's sort of the Columbus method of grazing for them to find the
Let them
alfalfa,
wander
the
and find their
discovery
way, huh?
method.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how we do it. And I have partitioned it off before in the past for them, but this year I didn't. I
Mhm.
sort of I I just let them. I mean, there's 150 head with calves on 20 acres. It's really not a huge area, and I knew it wasn't going to last them a ton. But the alfalfa was probably, I don't know, a good 2, 3, 4 inches, or probably 3, 4 inches tall already. And it was starting to get a little bushy. A few of them had figured out what was out there prior to us turning the rest of them out. So there were a few that had just preconditioned themselves and crawled
They
back
knew
and
the
forth.
candy's out there.
They knew where the candy was for sure. They kept dipping into the cookie jar per se. So that's how we manage it at home, especially in times when it's really lush. And that I would consider, even though we didn't have a ton of rain this year, we did have a few big snowstorms that blew through and got the moisture and got that crop going, or
So
what was left of that crop.
for those who don't know, maybe talk a little bit about what m makes for a higher risk alfalfa plant
Yeah.
or legume plant. Like,
So
how do you plan around that?
things that are higher risk are like when that alfalfa is growing really, really fast, like big rain events, fertilizer. We don't fertilize that field, so we're not forcing it to grow really fast. And then frost is another thing, which we actually had frost on it. It pretty much went through one night and took the entire field. Like the whole thing was like knotted, falling over. We left the cows out there. The frost can cause more nitrate issues. Yeah, I said that. But because we didn't fertilize it, we weren't concerned. We weren't forcing that plant to grow. The biggest thing with a lot of the risk factors is when you're forcing that plant to produce. Um, so it's I guess yeah, you're forcing it to grow. So because we weren't doing that, we weren't super worried. We were actually trying to abuse this pasture and stop it from growing so we can work it and seed it to some silage here this year. But that's how we manage it on the farm.
Hmm.
On pasture, it looks a little different. We don't use rumensin on pasture. We find to get them to free choice rumensin, it's tough. Like they won't. you have to mix it with the salt, and even then they don't like that it's a bitter taste in a lot of the mineral. So if I'm really worried, if we've had a lot of rain and it's really flush, I will start to mix in rumensin with a regular mineral and
Hmm.
in the salt. So I'll add the rumensin mineral to their non-rumensin mineral and the salt. It's a lot of work, and I don't like doing it, but we will, just to start to get them to uptake a little bit to help them with.
I haven't worked with rumensin at all. If it's used, is it basically like, yeah, you don't have to worry at all? Is there still a risk factor in
I
there?
I think there's still a risk factor from what, and as I said, I'm not an expert on this part. But what it does is it sort of keeps the rumen in check and keeps the protozoas in check. It reduces the potential for frothy bloat by inhibiting rumen protozoa. So that's what sort of the basis that I'm working on. And the other reason why I use it, if the pasture is going really lush in older cows, you can get the AIP pneumonia,
Hmm.
which the rumensin also helps prevent as well. So, which is another problem that you can get from grazing really lush pastures in addition to
Right.
bloat.
So the rumensin you're using isn't necessarily just for bloat, it's kind of a spectrum of of reasons
It
for it.
is, it is. And I do know of guys that will turn cows out onto like really lush, hayland almost like you could go hay the stuff, but they give a rumensin bolus to them.
Mm,
And
okay.
that's I think just putting it out in the mineral, it's a pretty easy it's
Easy
an easy
add-in.
thing. And it
And
has other benefits as well. So
so let's talk about bloat. Have you had incidences of bloat on your farm?
minor,
Hmm.
minor. We see it more in the younger, like honestly, we see it more, yeah, in the younger animals. Um, and a lot of it is just mitigated just by moving them off of it.
Right.
So I'm not saying we throw them out there, come back and check them 5 days later. And we have found that some animals are more susceptible. Certain cows are more susceptible to it than others. And
Huh.
so and breed doesn't matter. Like we run a Hereford Angus herd, a commercial cross, and I'll find it in both breeds, but it's not. We've never, knock on wood, have lost an animal
Hmm.
because of it. But if I do see someone bloating, or that looks puffy, I guess, is sort of what we go out and look for. And when we first turn them out there, so we turn them out at night. So I'll drive through them at night before sunset and just make sure everybody's doing okay and see who's found it and who hasn't. Um, and then the next morning, I'll get up and go out there and we'll check. And we pretty much make sure everybody stands up.
Hmm.
And if you get up, we see, are you getting up and walking off and stretching and then doing your normal cow behavior? That's sort of our checklist in our head.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Um, so that's sort of something that we look for. We did have my daughter's one show cow. I find she's a show cow first off, and she's more susceptible to things like she has bloated before. And I find once they bloat, say on grain is where we find most of our younger animals are the ones that get pushed on grain harder. Um, and they bloat on that. They do tend to be more susceptible. So I think if you have animals that you find the younger ones that are more susceptible, just keep a close eye on them. Maybe offer them some, lock them up during the day and make sure they have long hay and then turn them out at night. Um, I find they don't, they will graze at night, but it's also using the
It's
theory
not
of the
so.
sugars dipping and
Hmm.
all that. So
So when you say like certain animals are more prone to it, now does that go through the genetics? Have you been keeping an eye to see if
yeah,
maybe they're
and it's not
it's not
like
through
her
the
mom, the
genetics?
show cow's mom. Yeah, she's fine.
Fine. Huh. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
And yeah, and some of our other ones, like there's no rhyme or reason. So I don't know if their guts just aren't like because it's all an internal, it's all in their guts. So I don't know if maybe for whatever reason their guts are just a little imbalanced at that moment or the
Right.
one thing I do find though, and it would probably make most, some producers who haven't done this before freak out, is they will be loose, beyond loose, when you first turn them out, regardless of what you do, especially if you're doing like a spring or an early summer grazing on them. And our calves in turn are loose. And,
Yeah.
you just try to keep an eye on everyone. And some of your heavy milking cows, their calves, you'll be like, oh my gosh, you're gonna, should I treat you for scours? And that's just something that we just keep an eye on.
Hmm.
I
You
find
know
more
what's
the
going on.
calves, once you turn the cows out to alfalfa, the calves will just scout, like will be very loose. So that's
Right.
one thing. It's a lot of loose poo out there. So
So let's talk a little bit about what happens in the rumen with
Mhm.
bloat. Like, why does it happen?
Yeah. So it's pretty much the gas builds up and gets trapped and has nowhere to escape, I guess. Normally they burp,
Hmm.
but they can't burp for whatever reason. Like too much air is in there and they just can't. So then you get the left side of them that gets really puffy and that's where the problem comes in is then it starts to push on the lungs. And then I mean, by that point, you're in pretty rough shape already. So, yeah, you want to try to find it before it gets that far. Yeah, so it's
Right.
just that gas, and with the frothy bloat, it's my understanding is it's just like frothy gas in there, and if you've ever debloated an animal by stabbing them, you'll see the froth,
The bubbles come out.
the bubbles come out. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, and let's go back to kind of the grazing side of things. So, have you found that there are certain techniques for grazing the high legume pastures that really work for both the animal and the pasture? Because that's, you kind of want that mix. You don't,
Yeah.
we can graze for the animals, we can give ruminants, and we can push them
Mhm.
through it. But what techniques have you found that actually help with the pasture? And you said you're trying to knock out some of that alfalfa. Yeah, what have you seen?
Yeah, so I guess the biggest thing is, watching the timing of when you turn them out. That's a lot of it. Like if you don't want to mitigate it using other, man-made strategies and trying to use what you have, offer, and also make sure that they have access to water, making sure that they know where that access to water is. And maybe push them, herding them around like at first and
Mhm.
we're limiting access, doing some creative cross fencing so they can get in certain areas is sort of what we do. Sometimes we do cross fence it if it's, as I said, if it's growing really fast, we'll run a cross fence, a quick electric cross fence through things and then keep them to one side and then maybe going out middle of the day when and also try to watch your cows. um don't move them when they're all laying down. If they're actively eating and the majority of them are grazing, that might be a good time to move them. And yeah, it sometimes is harder to move them when they're content and happy um, where they are. But that's it's using your pasture and using what you have, and maybe if you do move them and you have a big grassy area, and then there's some alfalfa, a big patch of alfalfa, near it. Maybe just try to hold them in the grassy area first, so then they get some of that grass in there, but
To fill up their bellies a little bit.
to fill up
And
their
then what
bellies.
about moving them onto alfalfa after a rain?
So, yeah, that's you know make sure they're full.
Yeah,
That's what I can say. I guess that's the biggest take home message is making sure um that they're full and watching your cattle, observing, going out there and observing them prior and seeing, what times of the day are they eating? What time of the day are they loafing? And, just sort of laying around and being and trying to time your area, your grazing around that. And again, if you're really nervous, there is the mitigation um, tools around it to watch them. So.
hmm I think it's really interesting because quite often as producers, we're like, hey, we need to fit cows into our system
Mhm.
around our schedule, right? And they don't work on the same thing. We had a pasture that had a big stinging nettle patch.
Mhm.
And yes, not a legume, but it was a big stinging nettle patch. And we found that if they had had a mineral package, they wouldn't touch the stinging nettle till last when turning them into that paddock. However, if they had not had a mineral package, that was the first thing they'd go for. So I think sometimes we don't give the cattle enough credit that if they
Mhm.
have the options, like you said, feeding straw, right? If
Mhm.
they have the options, they know what's going to make them feel better.
Yeah.
But if we try to force them into
Yeah.
something, that's usually where we end up running into problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And knowing your animals, knowing, you know, and a lot of observation, like, like going out there and seeing, okay, well, they're actively eating from say 9 to noon. So maybe 1 o'clock would be, when they go to lay down, that's the time to move them. So
Mm.
then, they're ruminating. When they do get up, they will start to they're not hungry. They're not wanting that candy first. It's sort of like you wouldn't let your kid get up in the morning and eat a bowl full of, gummies for breakfast.
Unless it's
You
their birthday.
unless it's their birthday. I mean, there's exceptions to every rule, but I mean, if you don't want them sick or whatever, then yeah. So it's a lot of it is knowing your own herd and knowing, and observation and trial and error, I find is sort of how we've always ran and, taking our book knowledge and applying that practical, to the field and saying, okay, well, in the book it says this, and
How does that
and then
actually work in
ask
practice?
people that do it, yeah, and see
hmm
what everybody has their own method too.
They really do. They
Yeah.
really do. And then, so you're one of the few people that still have mixed farms. There aren't actually a lot. So talk to me a little bit about how have you used the cattle on the cropland? We talked a little bit about how you're trying the winter feeding
Yeah.
and that. How has that either benefited or made some of your parts of the operation more difficult when it comes to
It's
cattle?
Oh my gosh, we've benefited, and now that we've sort of tried to think outside the box even more, and we're pushing for like we used to be, okay, well, we'll start winter feeding on this date, like November 15th, but as we've gotten bigger, like so we started our operation, like Killy and I only started with 10 head and his dad had like 30 or 40 head. So we started with not many cows and we've taken it to where we are now, and we've sort of been toggling between 150 175 head depending on the year and the price of call cows really. So we had a really hard call last year, so we were up to close to 180 head last year, but we decided to get rid of quite a few old cronies over,
It's
we
a
did
good
a
time
hard
to do
call.
it.
Yeah, yeah, it was. It really was. So we're not a ride or die cow number person either. So we stagger back and forth. So and land around our area is stupid expensive. And I mean everything. It's all around Alberta and Western Canada, really. The price of land, especially if you're trying to compete with crop farmers that have hopes of $25 bushel canola again. Um, so what we've done is we've invested in some portable electric fencing, which for us has been a game changer. We've been able to throw cows onto stubble fields and just run them over the stubble fields for probably a month, to
hmm
where before we even bring them home to run them on the stubble fields, and like where our home quarter is, we have two quarters and then we go down to the lake bank. So the lake bank has always been part of our fall grazing. That's where we turn them. We run them in the bush. We run them down on the lake banks all fall. And then we bring them home and feed and wean and do all that fun stuff. But because we invested in the portable electric, we've been able to graze crop fields that we were never able, or that we didn't, or we never thought we were able to because of the fencing concerns. We thought, oh gosh, we're never going to be able to graze that because that's, so many thousands of dollars in new fencing. But, you invest in one thing, and it's been a game changer for us for the batter because we're not feeding them earlier, and we're actually able to, keep them on a stubble field for another, 3-4 weeks before we would bring them home. Whereas before they would be home for those 3 or 4 weeks. And so we'd
Right.
lessen our time up. So utilizing that winter grade, or that I say winter fall, onto the crop fields has
Do you feed
been.
hay on the stubble fields? No? Okay. I was going to
I,
ask
I
if
mean,
there's a concern
I
with
say no.
weeds with hay.
Typically no, but it depends on how much snow we get in
Fair.
October, and
Yeah.
what our lives look like in October, November. I've had to run bales out, the odd bailout, but we only feed, like, that time of year we're feeding slewgrass, and that's all
Hmm.
they're getting. You're just, and it depends on what the stubble, and like we have a lot of bush like on the edges of the stubble, or you have your bush patches that you farm around. We leave those up for habitat, really. We don't push bush in our fields. We're too small for that. We just go around stuff. And like by that point, some of the sloughs are already starting to dry up, so you have that extra slough grass in there. And the biggest thing with that too is the types of plants that live in sloughs. There are some poisonous plants that live in there,
Yep.
so you can't push those areas too hard either. So you really got to keep an eye on things. But at the same breath, we also, I say no, we don't feed hay out there, but
It
we
might
may
happen.
go the odd baler too. We try not to feed, because then that's a nightmare come spring,
To
trying
work
to
through the
put,
trash
yeah,
management.
work through the trash, and we try to no-till, and yeah. So
Hmm. Well, that's fantastic. And any words of encouragement for producers who, have been a little bit afraid to get their cattle out onto a high legume pasture that they might
yeah,
have sitting around?
I would say just try it. Like, even if you give them, take a little bit of electric fencing and try, 10, 20 acres, and give it to them, just start with a little, even if you fence off 10, 20 feet past the gate, or 100 feet past the gate or whatever, and just make a strip, see how it's going to do. Even while you're feeding them other stuff, see how it's going to work. You're going to, obviously, especially this time of year, if your feed reserves are starting to be tight, and say you have a hay field that you want to break up, um, just try it. Offer them. You're going to cut down on your hay. Obviously, they're gonna, and actually, they're probably gonna prefer the alfalfa, or whatever else you're offering. And I know, Amber, we talked prior to this. We've also been doing some stuff with some non-bloating legumes as well onto a few of our pastures, and we've done some salt seeding of sainfoin,
Cool.
which has taken a lot of time to get established. But once it's established, that's there, like, and it's on really bad soil. It was probably broke in the 20s and then reseeded in the 30s because it wasn't a great patch. So the seed mix that they put down there was less than ideal for cattle and grazing, and predominantly it's Kentucky bluegrass is what's down there. So we've been incorporating sainfoin seed into their salt for the past couple of years, and we've actually had a really nice stand. So they do have that pasture too now. That's part of our 7 pasture rotation up on our 1/4. And so that's neat to see all this sainfoin. And we're doing some stuff on some salinity acres with some birds fruit trefoil this coming year.
Oh, cool.
So we're also starting to incorporate other non-bloat legumes like the
Hmm.
trefoil and the
And with
sainfoin.
it, with the sandpoint through the salt, how long has it taken that to get established?
You can start to see it the next year.
Okay, cool.
And then we're relying, like we're still doing it a little bit, not quite as aggressively, but now we're relying upon what's there to
to spread.
reseed. But
Hmm.
the only problem is the cows hit that very first. Like you turn them in there and they're like right
Straight
to
to the
like right
sand
to
point.
all the. And it's neat because it's a very cool indicator because that thing is pink and you
Hmm.
can see it like everywhere. And the kids, like that's
So
my
cool.
younger
It's such
two
a pretty
kids.
flower.
It is. My younger two kids do sound point counts for me because it's easy to
That's fun.
it's easy to
That's
see.
fun.
So we're starting to, we're not ride or die alfalfa. That's not the only legume.
Hmm.
And like clover, that field is really high in clover, but again, we've never where we're introducing the sandfoin, we've never had an issue. It's mostly purple clover, not so much the alsike the alsike clover. So it's
Hmm.
really neat to see. And each year on some of the pastures, like you do have different, you know, plants,
That'll pop up.
especially that will pop up that you're like, oh, why is it like I think 2 years ago it was a clover year and it was just solid clover, but they handled it quite well. And, and on that pasture, as I said, with the bluegrass, it's really fine. So that was a concern to me because you didn't have your rough coarse, your bromes, your timothy, your orchards with the coarse leaves. You had your very fine leaves. So I was a little bit worried about that, but they
No
handled it.
issues. Well, I've heard it said that bloat is caused by a change in diet too quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of a really good summary of sort of what you've been seeing.
Yeah.
As long as that diet doesn't, it's not an overnight, hey, all you have to eat is alfalfa now.
Yeah.
They're gonna do pretty good.
Yeah, and like you can even get cows bloating on, alfalfa hay if you've been feeding them slew hay, and then all of a sudden you dump a rich bale out there, that can cause like you said, anytime you switch that diet too fast, it can cause huge problems in their
Right.
system.
Well, this has been amazing. Is there anywhere people can go if they want to follow you? You're a writer,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
anywhere they can go.
I've been I haven't done much writing but in the past couple months, but I do you can search my information on either Alberta Farmer Express or on the Canadian Cattlemen's website. Just search Jill Burkhardt and the information bar to see all the articles I have done. I don't blog anymore, but we also have like I'm on Instagram at Crooked Lake Farm, and I hang out on Twitter or X, I guess it's called now,
X.
from time to time too, under Crooked Lake Cows. So,
That's
um,
great. Well, thank you so much, Jill.
yeah. Thanks, Amber.
And
This has been fun.
that was Jill Burkhardt on Ruminating with Real Egg.